Hello and welcome to class today. How you guys doing? Good. All right, so far we've been talking about the pre-Greek peoples that will mold Greek civilization. We've talked about the island of Crete with the civilization at Knossos with the Minoans. We talked about Mycenae with the Mycenaeans. And the war that took place between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the Trojan War. And then we talked about the Dorian invasion. And if you guys remember, the Dorian invasion led to a loss of culture in the Greek peninsula or the Balkan peninsula. And that time period became known as the Greek Dark Ages. And during the Greek Dark Ages, bards who were singing historians would orally tell stories of the past. And as time went on, it was kind of like the game of telephone, right? More and more myth became involved with it, and a little less and less of fact. But there was always that nugget of fact somewhere in there. But there's also that exaggeration in the story as well. And the difficulty with Greek myths, especially myths about wars, is figuring out what exactly is fact, what is exaggeration, and what is flat out lie. But by the end of the Greek Dark Ages, the Mycenaeans, descendants, had moved to the Ionian Islands, and they became the Ionian Greeks, just off the coast of Turkey. And they were trading with the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, what did they have? They had the alphabet. So the writing from before the Dark Ages, we can't interpret. But the Greeks are going to invent a new alphabet. And from about that time period, when they develop a new alphabet that today we recognize as the Greek alphabet, to the beginning of the rumblings of the Persian Wars. That time period, it goes by two different names. Some people refer to it as the Archaic period, and some people refer to that time period as the pre-classical period. This is the time period from around 750 BC to around 500 BC. Okay? Around. So it's a rounded off date time period. And you're starting to look at people that are now referring to themselves as Greeks. Now, they refer to themselves regionally as Greeks. The only way only thing I can compare it to is Latin America. Latin America is an area that has a lot of countries: Mexico and Cuba and Nicaragua and Brazil and Argentina and Peru, and you get the point. And they have a lot of things in common. Latin American countries tend to be mostly Roman Catholic. Most of them speak Spanish, even though a few speak Portuguese. So in other words, they speak Iberian Peninsula languages. They have a lot in common with each other. So sometimes people refer to themselves as Latinos. They're from a Latin American country. But if you ask somebody from a Latin American country where they are from, they're not going to say, I'm from Latin America. They're going to say, I'm from Honduras, or I'm from Brazil, or I'm from Argentina, or I'm from Cuba, or I'm from Mexico, right? They think of themselves as Mexicans, Cubans, Hondurans, Brazilians, Peruvians, Argentinians, correct? So when we talk about this time period, it's important to point out that the city-states were literally individual countries. So Athenians, if you asked them what they were, they would have called themselves Athenians first. they would have recognized that they were from a region with a similar culture and a similar language, and they would have referred to themselves as Hellenes in that respect. Culturally, I'm a Hellenes or Greek, but there was no country called Greece during this time period. There will not be a country that is one unified Greece until King Philip, and he's going to unify Greece under him, and he's not even technically Greek himself. So that's a little foreshadowing. All right. So when we look at the Archaic periods, one thing that I want to point out is that people from the Greek Balkan Peninsula are now going to begin to spread out. And they're not going to recognize each other anymore as Mycenaean or Minoans or Dorians. They are going to recognize themselves as Hellenes or Greeks, and they're going to recognize themselves by their location of their city-states: Spartans, Athenians, Thebans, Olympians, Corinthians. You get the point. During the Archaic period, at that time period, you had the Neo-Assyrian Empire, or the Second Assyrian Empire, the Second Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire as your strong empires in the Middle East, or in the region that we studied earlier, the Fertile Crescent. Meanwhile, during this time period, down in Egypt is at the end of the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom period by this time period. At the beginning of this time period, and by the end of this time period, they're being ruled by the Libyans, and then by the Cushites, and right before the Persian Wars, they're being ruled by the Persians. So that gives you some connections to other civilizations. All right, demographics is the study of human populations. Economics is the study of wealth and what people value. So during this time period, there were 5 areas where changes occurred greatly in the Greek Balkan Peninsula. There were cultural changes. People were beginning to write again, as an example, and the arts began to improve. There were demographic changes. Populations began to go up. There were economic changes, namely farmers concentrated more on crop cultivation rather than raising livestock only. Land that was once considered wasteland was brought under cultivation due to the introduction of terraces into hillsides, or artificial flat spots carved into the hillsides. And the kinds of crops expanded. No longer were they just growing wheat, they were also growing things like figs and olives and grapes and all kinds of things. There were social changes. During this time period, Greece began to not be ruled, or many Greek city-states, especially Athens, began to not be ruled just by a king. Now, we're not to the point where they have a flat-out democracy yet until the end of this time period. But there are changes happening there. And we have military changes. The kind of warfare that will be fought will evolve. No longer is it just city-state against city-state, but it will be groups of city-states by the end of this time period merging together into alliances. And one thing history has taught us several times, when alliances happen and it does end up going to, when people do go to war, it becomes a much bigger and deadlier kind of warfare. Unrestricted, for lack of a better way of saying it. All right. The polis. The polis was a community with its own political organization. In Greek, the word polis is a city-state. It's a city that's its own country, literally. We still have city-states today. They exist. They're just rare. San Marino is a city-state. It's a country that's its own city and its state. Andorra. Andorra is a little city-state between Spain and France, right on the border. Vatican City, you could argue, is a city-state. It's not even a whole city. That's more like a neighborhood state. Some people would say Gaza for the Palestinians is a city-state. Singapore is a port city that's its own country. It's a city-state. Okay. Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, these are all examples of city-states. A typical polis or city-state was a small territory with an urban center. I want you to look at these two pictures here. And the urban center, the structure of the polis, usually had a wall around it. They would have a marketplace that served also as a meeting place called an agora. And they had a fortified hill that also served as a meeting place called an acropolis. And then look at the bottom picture, and you'll notice there are farms surrounding the city. So if you put the farms and the city together, that's a city-state. They weren't big. They weren't big. Greece was not a country yet. It was a region. The Greek people. I got to the wrong one. There it is. Now, the police were your government. And the most common kind of government during this time period was an oligarchy. An oligarchy. This is when a small group of noblemen hold the power. So I did say most of Greece is not ruled by kings yet. That is true. But they're not to the point where they're having a democracy yet. Not until the end of this time period. Instead, they're being ruled by the rich aristocrats and wealthy merchants. They would pass the laws, and your family name would basically determine your social class. So it was difficult to change classes. It wasn't impossible, but it was difficult. Eventually in Greece, you're going to have all four of these forms of government. So I want to bring them out. Monarchy was the rule by a king who inherited power and passed it on to his heirs. During this archaic time, two forms of government would be seen the most in Greece. You have an oligarchy, which we already described, a small group of wealthy families, and tyranny. A tyrant was a noble who seized absolute power. Now today, tyranny is always a bad word. But I want to say this about ancient Greece. Not all tyrants were necessarily bad in ancient Greece. Okay? Some of them were. Some of them were not. It just meant that they had absolute power. That's all. Okay? Didn't mean they were a dictator. A dictator would be different. And then eventually, by about 500 BC, right at the end of this time period, you're going to start to see polises have some form of democracy where the rule by the people and all adult male citizens eventually would be able to vote. But initially it started as all adult male citizens who own land. Then it became all adult male citizens. So you have this progression that happened in ancient Greek polises. Now, what did polises worry about? They tended to focus in on two problems: freedom and autonomy. Now, by freedom, it didn't mean freedom for everybody. It meant freedom from domination by a great power or by a different polis. In other words, they didn't want the Persians conquering them. They didn't want the Egyptians conquering them. They didn't want other city-states conquering them. That's what freedom meant in this context. They wanted to remain their own city-state. A city that's its own country, again. And they wanted to maintain autonomy. See, when somebody else conquers you, they make the laws for you. As long as you're independent, you make your own laws, right? And so at the polises, that's what they tended to focus on. How can we keep our freedom, and how do we keep our right to have our own culture and our own laws? Now, another political element of archaic Greece was the concept of the ethne, or as a group, the ethnos. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's groups of small communities that join together and special circumstances. So let's say there were a bunch of small farming communities, and they were between big communities like Athens and Sparta. They would join together just to fight to get off the big boys, so to speak. Like Delphi, as an example. Delphi might merge with Thebes. And each of these groups, though, then recognized that they were different from each other, and after they fought off the big boys, they would go back to being separated. Every once in a while, they would combine together and form a city-state or a polis, but most of the time they stayed separated. And today, when you have groups of people that are different, that identify themselves differently from others, we call them an ethnicity, right? Yeah, we get this from the word ethne. Ethnic group comes from the Greek word ethnos. It's important to point out that Greeks never developed a unified country until King Philip of Macedonia. Yet they did have sort of this nationality identity. We are Hellenes. What unified them, even though they weren't the same country? They had a common language. They all spoke Greek. They worshiped most of the same gods. And they would meet every 4 years in communal traditions such as the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games is probably the greatest example of them meeting together. There were other things, and we're not going to go through them all, but when they met at the Olympic Games, it was a religious event as much as a sporting event. They were trying to honor the gods through their sport. Some things important to point out. Married women weren't allowed to attend. The winners did not receive gold, silver, and bronze medals. They received an olive wreath for their victory. And if they won, they would go home as heroes. But there were certain city-states, if they lost, they went home in shame. For example, Sparta. The Spartans were supposed to win all the time, right? Yeah. Some of the sports that you would have, you'd have running events. It is important to point out that they had an event called the Stadia Race, or Stadium Race. A stadia is about 200 meters. So they would have a stadia race. They would have a dialis race, which is about 2 stadia, or 400 meters. They had something called the Dolichos, which was around 24 stadia. So you can figure out, okay, that's about 3 miles. They had a jumping event where they would have weights, and they would pull the weight, and as they jumped before they landed, they would release the weight behind them, and the weights would actually help them jump farther because it would give them more momentum. Of course, they had wrestling. They had a kind of boxing that they participated in. They had fencing events. They also had horse races as well. So there were all kinds of other events that they did. But all these events were connected to religious stories that the Greeks had. During the Olympic time period, all the Greek city-states agreed they would not go to war with each other. It was a time of no war. Even if they were at war. I hate you. I want to kill you. But we have the Olympics. You're going to have to wait. Okay. Yes?
Does that still happen today? Like, if there was
No.
During World War II, did they...
During World War II, there was no Olympics in 1940 or 1944.
That's what I thought, but
yeah. And there was no Olympics in 1960. Yeah. So during the World Wars, there was no Olympics. All right, the Greek colonies. The Greeks made colonies. The reason they made colonies was because, frankly, their polises were becoming too populated. They were too successful during the Archaic period. During the Dark Ages, you had sons and daughters. A lot of them died. A lot of them. So when you died, you didn't have a lot of kids to split your land up with. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. But after the Dark Ages, during the Archaic and pre-classical Greek period here, that's all going to change. More people are living because of better farming techniques. Now that's a good thing, but it created a big problem. There wasn't more land. Most of Greece is mountainous. Mountainous land doesn't grow crops very well. So the Greeks, a lot of them would take off and form a new Greek polis. and they began expanding westward into the central Mediterranean basin, like on the island of Sicily. Sicily is like the soccer ball of Italy that Italy wants to kick. Oh, there's my clock right there. The most famous Western colony on Sicily was Syracuse. How many of you ever heard of Syracuse University here in the United States? You've heard of Syracuse University? You know what state it's in? Do you?
I don't.
It's in New York. So when people were first colonizing our country, they colonized the East Coast, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you had cities like New York City and Albany form along the Hudson River Valley and along Long Island, right? Well, Syracuse is in western New York. So this area, New York, Albany in the east, Syracuse is in the western part of New York. Today we think of the western part of New York as the eastern part of the country. But when Syracuse was first made, Syracuse, New York, the western part of New York was kind of like the frontier, if that makes sense. And it was a college town, right? It was kind of like a colony of more eastern cities like New York and Albany. It wasn't technically a colony, but they took on the name Syracuse to represent that. Yeah. And there would be a connection between western New York and eastern New York. Yeah. That's why the name Syracuse. Why they call them Orangemen, I don't know. That's going to be another day's discussion. All right. If you look at the map up here on the slide, it's kind of hard to tell because the scale of it is actually too close. So let me describe it. Where it says Ionia, this is the very western edge of what is today the country of Turkey. Okay? The very western edge. And without getting too complicated, you're going to see some famous cities through here. You could have Ephesus. How many of you have ever read the Bible before? If you've ever read the Bible, you're familiar with the Greek city Ephesus, because there's a Bible book named after it called Ephesians, but we don't call it Ephesians, we call it Ephesians. How many of you have ever heard of the book Ephesians before? Yeah. Achaia. Phoenicians. Okay. These Samos, Isos down on the bottom, Smyrna. These are all the Ionian Greeks. They moved out of the Balkan area and they moved along the Aegean coast. They basically took on that eastern and central part of the Mediterranean. They spread out and they took their culture with them. Now, these Ionian Greeks, when the Persian War happens, are going to be a very important part of the discussion. So keep them in mind. But for right now, what I want you to know is they trade a lot with their founding city. And a lot of these were connected to Athens. Some of them were connected to Sparta, but most of them were connected to Athens. Now, what was different about Greek colonies than what we have later on, I got ahead of myself. What new social group emerged in Greece? You began to have the nouveau riches. Nouveau riches, or the new rich. Life became increasingly difficult, though, for the old-fashioned small farmer. They didn't grow enough crops. And family property had to be split up amongst children every generation until the plots of land were too small. And farmers couldn't switch crops because they lacked the resources or surplus land to tide them over through the unproductive period of change. So many farmers had to take out loans. So once they took out loans and they weren't able to pay them, what happened? They became slaves. You can't pay your debt back, then that's what happened. You became a slave. And especially in Sparta. By the time Sparta gets to the Persian War, Sparta is going to be 90% slave. So keep that in mind. Military changes. Soldiers during the Archaic period were the rich people. They were landowning farmers. Poor people weren't supposed to fight in battles. And I'm saying poor people, let's call them what they were, slaves. Okay? Their shields were called hoplons, Greek hoplons. And so the Greek soldier became known as the hoplite. And they fought a style of warfare known as the phalanx. And it was literally two square groups of men colliding into each other. And this phalanx would become very effective in the Greek landscape. Why? There were narrow valleys with mountains on each side. So this form of warfare became the Greek style of warfare. But the Greek style of warfare would not be effective in open plains. So the Greeks were never able, for example, to conquer Egypt or the Persian Empire, even though they defeated the Persians later on. We're going to talk about that. It's not going to be until the Macedonians changed the Greek phalanx, and I'll talk about how they changed it when we study them, that the Greeks are going to, quote unquote, conquer the world. Okay? Their style of warfare was designed for where they lived. Mountainous areas, tight areas. Yeah. The Greeks also picked up Phoenician writing. You can look at this later on your own, but if you look at this, you'll see the Phoenician letter. I think that's gray. And then the early Greek letter, and then the Roman Latin letter, and then the modern English letter. So, for example, on the far right, letter A, that's our modern letter. And the third letter to the left, if you go from right to left, I know that's backwards, but just go that direction. As you go from right to left, you're going farther back in time. So that early Greek letter kind of looks like our letter A. In Latin, at one time it kind of looked like a backwards letter F, didn't it? And then the Phoenician, you can kind of see where it was kind of a letter A, but it also kind of looks like a letter K written by a kindergartner who can't make the stick go exactly where it belongs. It's going through the middle of the little check thing, right? So you can see how the letters of the alphabet changed. But the important thing about the alphabet is you sound it out. And the Phoenicians are the ones who invented this. And so when we sound out things today, we use the term phonetic. You're reading phonetically when you sound things out. And we get the word phone from that as well. So the Phoenicians created an alphabet where you sound things out. What do you do on a telephone? You are listening and talking, right? All right. All right. I do like to take a look at the art styles. There are three kinds of vase arts that are going to come out during this time period. Yellow is the oldest, and red figure style is going to be the newest. So let's take a look at this. At the beginning of the Archaic period and at the end of the Dark Ages, you would have this yellow or geometric style. If you look carefully at the vases, it's all geometric figures, circles, squares, and the like. Geometric figures. Eventually, by about the 500s, towards the middle part of the Archaic period, you're going to have black figure. They're going to depict things that they do: warfare, stories of the gods, playing a game. Okay, all these things are things that you can see in black figure art. And then red figure pottery would be the kind of pottery that you would see by the time we get to classical Greek period. So this, when we think of Athens at its finest, that's red figure pottery. But it evolves. It's important to point that out. And Greek pottery is changing. So what's that telling you? They're beginning to value. Progress. The Greeks were valuing progress and change and life getting better. Unlike the Egyptians, which we studied earlier, which kept the same art style for 3,000 years, right? Okay. So art tells us a lot about the values of the culture. Greek architecture, especially their columns, has a major impact on us today. So I do want to spend a little time on it. There are three types of capitals on Greek columns. Greek columns first tended to be fluted. That means there's like indentations all the way around that go up and down the shaft of the column. The capital is the top part of Greek architecture. And there are three kinds of Greek columns: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And here we can see those same fluted columns. Doric columns have that square top. Ionic, I think it looks like a scroll. Some people say it looks like something else, but I think it looks like a scroll. And then the Corinthian almost looks like a flowery thing on top, right? All right, so let's take a look at this in ancient architecture. Here are Doric columns at the Parthenon. These are Ionic columns at the temple of Nike and Athena in Athens. And these are Corinthian columns at the temple of Zeus. Now we've already looked at Egyptian columns. We looked at Greek columns now, and we studied the Persians as well. We haven't studied Roman or Islamic or Romanesque or Eastern Roman Empire or early English Gothic columns yet. But the fluted columns is definitely a Greek trait, a Greco trait. Meanwhile, the Egyptian, they have the unique papyrus top to them. So why am I talking about this even? Well, because it affects our modern architecture. So at the Capitol building, on the rotunda, if you look up at it, you have Corinthian columns up there. You see them? At the Lincoln Memorial, you have Doric columns. At the Jefferson Memorial, you have Ionic columns. In Liverpool, England, you have those Egyptian-inspired columns in Liverpool, England. And the Persian columns, the ancient Persian column style is on Iran's foreign ministry building in Iran today. So all these architectural styles you see in modern architecture, and they usually represent something from the past. So just keep that in mind. All right. The people of the Greek city-states had similar religion. They were almost the same religion. They worshiped the gods on Mount Olympus. We'll go in more detail about them later because I have a whole lesson about them. But here's some basic things about Greek religion. They were polytheistic, which meant that they believed in more than one God. There was no official dogma. In other words, there wasn't an official book like the Bible or the Quran or Rig Veda or something like that. Rituals, therefore, were important for establishing relationship with the gods. Each city also had its own patron god or goddess. So, for example, Athena was the goddess of Athens. Apollo and Artemis Orthia were the gods of Sparta. They took them on, so to speak, as their city's god. And the Greeks' view on death and the afterlife were similar to the Mesopotamian views. The soul could go on. I really don't want to spend as much time on this, but Greek followers of Demeter believed in a blissful life after death. So you had a Demeter cult, you had an Orphic cult, and often people would go talk to the oracles at Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was thought to be able to communicate with the Greek gods. What gave rise to natural philosophy and physical science? Why was this important? Some original minds no longer accepted the explanations of physical phenomena given in myths. For example, I don't think lightning comes from Zeus. I don't think he's throwing lightning bolts. I've noticed that not all lightning bolts are coming from Mount Olympus. They're coming from other places too. And so you began to have scientists who began to study certain aspects of science, like Hippocrates and Aristotle, trying to figure out the world through logical processes. And they begin developing the scientific method that we use today during the late Archaic period, just before the classical Greek period. Some important early Greek philosophers, Xenophanes, he believed in one God. He believed the gods of the myths were only helpers of a supreme God. And he criticized Homer's depiction of the gods. And Anaxagoras flat out denied the Greek gods even existed. By the way, remember, he did this at a time when most everybody believed in the Greek gods. Democritus called for indivisible parts. Small little parts make us up. we're not just skin and bone, but skin is made up of these small little pieces. And those are called cells. And then cells are made of indivisible parts called atoms. They laughed at him. We know that's true now. And we actually know that atoms are made of parts now. Electrons and protons, right? And we're now thinking electrons and protons could be made of quarks, right? We keep going down. Pythagoras is the one that took the mathematical concepts of the Babylonians, and he gets a lot of the credit for it, like the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And it's called the Pythagoras is the one, for a long time, people thought he came up with it. We now know the Babylonians had that theorem a good 1,000 years before Pythagoras did. So here's the question about Pythagoras, and this is a great debate that you're going to see. Did Pythagoras rediscover it? I mean, it's not that hard to figure. It is hard to figure it out, but I mean, it's not impossible to think that some two different cultures invented the same thing at two separate times of history. Makes sense, right? Or did Pythagoras learn it from people who could read Mesopotamian cuneiform and then take credit for it? That is a debate right now that historians are looking at. All right, so we've laid the groundwork. Classical Greece, as we're used to thinking of the Greeks, all these things are the groundwork for them. And they are becoming wealthy, especially the city-state of Athens, because of trade. And as they become wealthy, they're going to start attracting attention from an outside empire who is very wealthy and wants to become wealthier. The Persians. And that's where we're going to leave it off and pick it up on another day. You guys were great today. I really mean that. Thank you. You did a great job because we had to use two tablets, one to show you guys and one for me to record this. And those of you at home listening to this, thank you for paying attention. And you guys have a wonderful weekend, okay? All right, guys. Thank you.